Hi, everybody. Episode, who knows what? 38? I don't really know what episode this is. All right, I have cans behind me. That was bad planning on my part. Oh, and my little clicker won't work. Oh my God, I'm gonna die trying to do this. I won't die, it's good. I'm okay. Return of conservatism. Reagan. Okay, you have to know that Reagan is the Republican superhero. Cape and everything. Everybody, when they talk about Republican, the main number one favorite Republican they talk about is Ronald Reagan. Here's partly why. America's liberal era was from 1932, FDR at the beginning of the Great Depression, not the beginning, the middle of the Great Depression, to 1980, ended with Jimmy Carter, with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. He focused on reducing the size and power of the federal government. Republicans, shrink the government. Challenged the Soviet Union through a reaffirmation of America's superpower status. Ronald Reagan gets credit for bringing the Cold War to a conclusion with us as the sole superpower. During the 1970s, the population of the Sun Belt continued to grow and became the religious and conservative part of the country with growing political power. As many of you know, it is referred to as the Bible Belt. The Bible Belt. Again, this was Nixon's Southern strategy, and it has been the Southern strategy for most presidents since then, Republican presidents since then, to have, what's happening? To have focus on the South to get votes in the Deep South, where the Bible Belt is. Okay, so you have to know we went from the silent majority, the hard hats, to the moral majority. The moral majority is the Christian Coalition with Ralph Reed. I don't know why he's not part of the benchmarks. The Christian Coalition, we have televangelists, and this is what the moral majority or the Christian right considers their most important things. Outlawing abortion, opposition to state recognition and acceptance of homosexuality, opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment for women, opposition to the strategic arms limitation talks. If you remember correctly, most Republicans are hawks, not doves. Doves mean no war, hawks means war. So limiting arms was a no-go. Enforcement of a traditional vision of family life with the wife at home, barefoot and pregnant like the 50s and 60s. 50s and 60s are gone. Most people need two parents working to be able to survive. Censorship of media outlets that promote an anti-family agenda. In other words, anything that promoted abortion or sex outside of marriage or homosexuality or anything like that, that it should absolutely not be in media or on TV. Religious organizations like the Moral Majority and the Christian Coalition flourished as the U.S. experienced the greatest religious revival since the Second Great Awakening in the early 19th century. Homosexuality is Satan's diabolical attack upon the family that will not only have a corrupting influence upon our next generation, but will also bring down the wrath of God upon America. Jeez, freaking gays. The gays. So yeah, religion and politics. The evangelical movement helped fuel the rise of the new right, conservative political voices, very much the middle of the state and the Deep South, which are now the nexus for the Republican Party. So evangelicals and Republicans, still today. Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. That's one of the most famous Reagan quotes. Government is the problem. Remember, Republicans now reduced the size of the federal government. By the late 1970s, Reagan had replaced Goldwater as the leader of this movement of Republicans. If we trade our freedom for the soup kitchen of the welfare state, the nation will take the first step into 1,000 years of darkness. In other words, welfare is bad. Welfare is bad. And the beginning of us demonizing the poor. So you have to know neoconservatives. Neo means new. This new conservatism started with Reagan. Economic freedom is an indispensable means toward the achievement of political freedom. It's all about the rich, the rich, the rich, cutting taxes on the rich. They went from 75% down to like 25%, although the middle classes and the lower classes got stalemated and their taxes didn't go down. Neoconservatism originated in the 1970s as a movement of anti-Soviet liberals, that establishment versus the anti-establishment, those hippies, and social democrats in the tradition of Truman, Kennedy, and Johnson. So they were opposed to liberal Democrats like Truman, Kennedy, and Johnson. Reagan united the religious right with the traditional fiscal conservative Republicans and the neoconservatives who hated the excesses of the left. That is still the way it is today, ever since the 80s, and that's why Reagan is seen as a superhero of the Republicans and this neo-conservative movement that blends religious right with fiscal conservatives, meaning smaller government. In 1980, Reagan challenged a Carter administration that was seemingly incapable of handling economic woes and foreign affair issues. It was a train wreck. Remember, Carter was a train wreck. We had the oil embargo of 1973. We had the oil crisis that had me as in high school in lines to get gas, and OPEC drove the prices way up high. This is the greatest country in the world. We have the talent, we have the drive. All we need is a leadership. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Reagan famously said this in the debate with Carter. Clearly the answer was no, we are not better off. Our country is a train wreck. We are not better off. But now, today, and ever since then, since 1980, from that debate, everybody always says, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago, to determine whether we need a new president or not. Okay, Reagan was also a Washington outsider, like Carter, the peanut farmer from Georgia, but he was a charismatic speaker and denounced big government. He was a charismatic speaker because he was a famous actor. That's what he did for a living, was speak. He destroyed Jimmy Carter. Not a chance, Jimmy, not a chance. Remember, just minutes after January 20th, 1981, when he took office, the Iranian hostage crisis came to a close. Just minutes after that. He was nearly killed by this chimp. This chimp attacked him that was in a movie with him, and he was nearly killed by the chimp. In a movie they made, Bedtime for Bonzo. Okay, again, Iran released the hostages after 444 days. This was obviously seen as an intentional slight to Jimmy Carter, that they released him right after Reagan became president. Reagan's always seen with a cowboy hat. That's one of the most famous pictures of Reagan in a cowboy hat. George W. Bush is also always seen in a cowboy hat, and Teddy Roosevelt is always seen in a cowboy hat. Ronald Reagan's enormous popularity rested on his ability to assure Americans that the best was yet to come. But his economic policies led to a soaring national debt because he cut taxes so low that all that money, like 75% to 25% of the rich, all of a sudden there doesn't exist anymore. So a soaring national debt and unprecedented growth in income inequality. Teachers like me in 1984 making $13,900, but stockbrokers making $80,000 the same year. Just way inequities between the rich and the poor or the middle class. The middle class, for all 36 years that I've been a teacher, the middle class has been stagnated while the rich keep getting monumentally more and more rich, as you know, with like 3 of the richest Americans having the wealth of the bottom 50% today. I think you remember that I told you that my dad, when he was an engineer at BF Goodrich, they made tires. he made his salary, and the CEO of the company made about 150 times what my father made. However, today, from the normal worker in a certain any organization, now the CEO makes like 1,500 times more than the average worker. I mean, it's insane. Just look at Bezos with Amazon, and people make $15 an hour. And I think somebody just said it to me. Gosh, Ryan, I don't remember what you told me. It's like $222,000 a minute that Bezos makes. Was that what it was, Ryan? I think it's a minute. $222,000 a minute. What? The election of Reagan and the rise of conservatism is known as the Reagan Revolution. Conservative. And again, you remember that he got assassinated because John Hinckley Jr. wanted to impress Jodie Foster, who turns out now is a lesbian. So I guess it was going to be a harder job than he expected, like killing the president might not have been sufficient. Nonetheless, John Hinckley Jr. attempted to kill Reagan. Happily, he wasn't a good shot, and he missed. He told jokes at the hospital. I think he said to his wife something like, honey, I forgot to duck. And one of these guys that was shot became paralyzed, Jim Brady. And the Brady bill under Clinton is going to be for Jim Brady. And it says there has to be a 3-day waiting period for guns and that you have to have background checks. Even today, people are fighting against that, like that's somehow bad. I don't know how that could be bad, but yet it is. White House Press Secretary James Brady was paralyzed from a gunshot during the attack. I don't know which of those men is him. Permanently disabled from a gunshot wound to the head. There you go. That was his crush that he decided to freaking kill the president for. Over the past 7 months, I've left you dozens of poems, letters, and love messages in the faint hope that you could develop an interest in me. Although we talked on the phone a couple of times, I never had the nerve to simply approach you and introduce myself. The reason I'm going ahead with this attempt now is because I cannot wait any longer to impress you. Tried to kill the president to impress Jodie Foster. An actress. Reagan sought to restore economic growth through supply-side economics, also known as Reaganomics, also known as trickle-down economics. Gave huge tax cuts to the rich in the belief that the rich would then spend that extra money that they had on building bigger businesses and more businesses and stronger businesses, which would employ way more people, pay those people better, and the entire economy would get better. They didn't do that. They socked away money in tax havens offshore, or they buy back stocks today. They buy back stocks with it, and the rich got exceedingly wealthy as a result, and nothing really actually trickled down. That was a fallacy. It did not trickle down to the lower classes. Ask me, I've been there my whole life. What I want to see above all is that this country remains a country where someone can always get rich. Again, I was a teacher. I made $13,900 in 1984, my first year of teaching. And a stockbroker in New York City would make like $80,000 or $100,000 at that time. Even today, teachers are paid so pitifully, woefully bad that I was talking to one of my former students, Steph, who is an engineer now. And I think she probably has a master's. But just now in May of 2018, she got hired for $70,000. And now 2 years later, she gets paid $82,500 2 years later. At the most I've ever made was maybe about $82,000. This spring, she will probably be up to $90,000. I've never, ever made that. Currently, I make $64,000 with a master's from The Ohio State University, and that's after 36 years of teaching. We figured it out that if you were in this district, you make $40,000 as a first-year teacher. So if somebody started when Steph did in May of 2018, they actually would be making $36,000 because we got a pay raise since then. They made $36,000. But anyway, let's say it was $40,000. It would take 19 years in Sumner County to make $12,500 like Stephanie did in 2 years as an engineer. Make good decisions about your future aspirations and what you want to be in life. Teaching is a nice thing. It's a nice thing. I like teaching. I've liked it my whole life. But you are going to be broke. You're going to be broke. I like it. I like teaching. I never had this whole YouTube thing going on. Now I'm a YouTube star. For heaven's sakes, who knew? Reaganomics was based on the assumption that tax cuts on the wealthy would free up funds for new investments. Some people did. Some people didn't make new investments. This is kind of a left-leaning political cartoon taking a jab at Reagan. Food stamps, cut them, let them eat cake. Handicapped, tell them to stand on their own 2 feet. Legal aid, so sue me. Education, they'll have to learn the hard way. Children, tell them to grow up. Elderly, sorry mom. Vietnam vets, sounds like a personal problem. Unemployed, have not, want not. A lot of the social programs and the stuff for the poor and middle class was cut during the Reagan era. It was about the rich. In 1981, Congress passed 25% tax cuts, hoping to reduce government's role in American life. And then this is trickle-down economics. Give the rich lots and lots and lots of money, and it'll trickle down to the poor, which is obviously the reverse of what a fountain would look like, because most of it stayed with the rich and pretty much nothing trickled down to the poor. Reaganomics failed as the U.S. entered a very bad recession and unemployment rose to 11%. In 1983, the economy finally improved as oil prices decreased. OPEC, just in time for a re-election campaign. Isn't that special? Reagan is easily re-elected. Tax cuts plus increased military spending and the cost of entitlement programs like Medicare and Social Security led to unprecedented growth in the national debt. So we increased spending on Medicare and Social Security, we increased spending on the military, and as a result, the national debt got absolutely crazy out of hand during the Reagan era. Here it shows that Clinton balanced the budget. We'll be talking about that in our future, that Clinton had a balanced budget. After the excesses of Reagan and Bush 1, H.W. Bush. Americans are conservative. What they want to conserve is the New Deal. George Will. The New Deal, remember? FDR's New Deal. There was no Reagan Revolution. Ronald Reagan did far less than he had hoped, and a hell of a lot more than people thought he would. That's funny. Young Republicans. Reaganomics resulted in a widening gap between the rich and poor for the first time in the 20th century. And of course, it was right after I got out of college, and I was the poor. I was not the rich. I was certainly the poor as a teacher. Reagan cut discretionary spending. That means the part that he gets to determine how much is spent on education or transportation or the military, which is always huge. The military is always like 50%, basically the minimum. I think Trump spends 57% on the military. The Democrats generally spend closer to 50% on the military. But either way, discretionary spending, generally 50% of it, 50% of all of our money goes to the United States military. Hawks, that's what hawks. But discretionary spending for food stamps, low-income housing, education programs, and federal aid to the states, cut during the Reagan era. In 1984, Reagan was opposed by Democrat Walter Mondale and Vice President candidate Geraldine Ferraro, the first woman to run as a vice presidential candidate, and now Kamala Harris is now going to be the first woman vice president because they didn't win. They lost really, really bad. Really, really bad. Wiped out. Reagan easily won re-election. Conservatives fought against social issues like abortion and affirmative action. Remember, this is the Christian coalition, so anything that has to do with social issues regarding homosexuals or abortion and Roe versus Wade, it became known as the culture wars. Liberals against conservatives. Affirmative action, you have to know affirmative actions. There are programs to help black people or minorities to be able to get better jobs than what they've ever been offered before because of their race. God hates fags. Weird. Pro-life, pro-choice. Reagan and foreign policy. He's from California. He always rode horses. He had a ranch in California. Reagan and his neocons, neocon is neo-conservative, new conservatives, supporters favored an aggressive foreign policy, hawks, but the Iran-Contra scandal would reflect the risks of increased American intervention in world affairs. You have to know that Reagan is known for bringing about the end of the Cold War. Reagan and the neocons sought a foreign policy where the U.S. could flex its superpower muscles, unlike Ford and Carter. Ford and Carter were basically controlled by OPEC, if you remember correctly, the oil-producing countries. In 1983, these are all these places that Reagan sent troops all over the world. Reagan sent U.S. troops as part of an international peacekeeping force to Lebanon. This is going to be bad news for us in our future. So in October 1983, a suicide bomber crashed a bomb-filled truck into a U.S. Army barracks in Lebanon, as in the country, and 241 American soldiers were killed. It was awful. It was awful. 241 Americans were killed in this Lebanese bombing. Reagan withdrew the U.S. troops from Lebanon, but suffered no political consequences. Like some people said that he should have gone to war against Lebanon for having killed 241 Americans, but instead he withdrew our troops, but nobody did anything. He didn't suffer any consequences from that. A liberal or Ford or Carter probably would have been seriously punished for not having done anything about it. In 1983, Reagan sent U.S. troops to Grenada to crush a Marxist coup. Remember, we have the Cold War still going. 1989, the Berlin Wall is going to come down. 1991 is the end of the Soviet Union. So we are still fighting communism and fighting against Soviet Union and China about communism. We go to all of these places. Reagan supported Corazon Aquino's overthrow of dictator Ferdinand Marcos. So we're going into places. We're not theoretically at war, but we send our military into a lot of different places. Reagan is a hawk. He uses our military all over the world to combat what he sees as communist aggression. In 1986, he ordered airstrikes on Libya in response to the support of terrorist activities. Libyans had bombed an airline and brought down an airline in the 80s. And then the most famous thing that could have and should have hurt him, which really didn't in the grand scheme of things, was Oliver North and the Iran-Contra scandal, which dominated Reagan's second term. So, Reagan accused the Sandinistas in Nicaragua of trying to spread communism, the Sandinistas, in Latin America by supporting communist forces in El Salvador. So he's trying to be anti-communist. Okay, so in 1985, U.S. diplomats secretly arranged arms. We sold arms to Iran in return for the release of American hostages. I don't think it's the Iranian hostage crisis. That was like 4 years before. But so we sold them arms. Then the U.S. used the money they got from Iran to aid the Nicaraguan Contra rebels, even though the United States Congress didn't know we were doing that, which is where everything was basically illegal. Congress already had banned helping the Contras, but Reagan does it through the back door by getting money from Iran, who bombed our people and held our people hostages earlier. Reagan had vowed not to negotiate with terrorists, and yet he's working with Iran, who had taken hostages, our own hostages, just before he became president. The Iran Contra investigators stated that even if Reagan had no knowledge of this, which is what he claimed he didn't, then he should have known. He should have known that his military was doing this. And that's why, we find out that supposedly he had no knowledge of it, but most people believe he did. Oliver North is the one that was in the military that was supposedly doing all of this stuff. But Oliver North also got off. He now works for Fox News. The Iran-Contra scandal made Reagan look like a senile old man because he was like, oh, I don't remember, I forget, I don't know. Most people believe he did know, but that was just his way of trying to act like he had nothing to do with it. He remained popular and became known as the Teflon president because even this huge scandal that broke out during his administration regarding him, it didn't affect how people felt about him. Politics is just like the movies. You have a hell of an opening, you coast for a while, and then you have a hell of a close. The end of the Cold War. Gorbachev, because of the birthmark on his head. Gorbachev. By reaffirming America's superpower status and re-engaging the Soviet Union in a costly arms race, we had building up arms. Détente ended with Carter. No more détente. Ronald Reagan successfully created the conditions that led to the USSR's demise and the end of the Cold War. This arms race, is probably the one that did it. It cost so much money to continue making these arms, and they really didn't have it. Reagan denounced Soviet aggression in Afghanistan and renewed the arms race. From 1979 until 1988, the Soviet Union had gone into Afghanistan in a war against Afghanistan. They also did not win that war, just like us. Just like us, they did not win that war. Reagan supported the Strategic Defense Initiative, as you know, known as Star Wars, because of a video game we played when we were kids called Star Wars, it was also obviously the movie, which was a system of lasers fired from satellites that could destroy incoming Soviet missiles, so that we could fire lasers from satellites to destroy these missiles. So it was called Star Wars. It was a system of lasers fired from satellites that could destroy incoming Soviet missiles. Oh, I have that there too. Reagan hoped a super expensive arm race would bankrupt the USSR because they'd have to choose guns or butter. Their people were starving. I went there in 1990, right before the fall of the Soviet Union. I went to Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg before, then it was Leningrad, and now it's St. Petersburg again. But at the time, in 1990, I was there. It was called Leningrad because it was still the Cold War. And then in 1991, the Cold War ended. But when we were there, people were starving. You could go to the stores and there was nothing there. Butter, bread, water, nothing. They had nothing. They had huge lines just to get basic supplies from a store. They were broke. Privately, he feared a re-escalation of the Cold War. It turns out they were a lot more broke and were not capable. In 1981, the Soviets clamped down on Poland's massive union called Solidarity, and they received economic sanctions from the U.S. Poland received money from us, and we sanctioned the Soviet Union. And then, as if it weren't bad enough, 3 Soviet leaders died from 1982 to 85. 82, 84, 85. 3 of their leaders died in that fast. This combined with arms talks breaking down the tensions. After Chernenko was Gorbachev, who was going to be the end of the Soviet Union. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the USSR. Importantly, he instituted new policies of perestroika, economic reform, and glasnost is openness, meaning you could say almost anything on the streets now. Before, during the Cold War, you could not do that. When I was there in 1990, people were reading the Bible and talking about the Bible and preaching on corners. And then there were other people that were arguing about politics on the corners. During all of the Soviet Union, for most of that time, there's no way you could have done that stuff. But in the summer of 1990, you could tell that these reforms had taken place. Gorbachev then withdrew Soviet forces from Afghanistan and signaled a willingness to discuss disarmament, getting rid of some of these missiles and war nukes. In 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty to have smaller weapons, less weapons, fewer weapons. And then famously in 1987, Reagan gave the speech in Berlin, challenging Gorbachev to tear down this wall and end the Cold War. It happened in 1987. The Berlin Wall doesn't come down until 1989, and actually Bush is president when it comes down. Bush does not get credit for it, Reagan does. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Huge, famous words. Famous, famous, famous words. In 1989, democratic changes took place in several communist countries, and finally, on November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down. 1961 to 1989, not to be confused with the Berlin Airlift, which is 1948, June of 48 to May of 49. Has nothing to do with the Berlin Wall. Communist regimes, after that time, they all started becoming not communist. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Eastern Germany, Romania, they all start becoming not communist. The end of communism is coming soon. In 1991, Boris Yeltsin stopped a military coup against Gorbachev. Gorbachev went on vacation to the Black Sea, and then everybody back in the Soviet Union like, oh yeah, he's gone, we've taken care of him, and he was just on vacation. It was the weirdest coup. It didn't work. In December of 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War was over. The U.S. had now become the sole superpower. Now in 2020, it is becoming harder and harder to be the sole superpower, especially with the rise of China. So, the Cold War ends in December of 1991. All of the satellite states are no longer the Soviet Union. Now it's just back to Russia. It's Russia again in 1991, not the Soviet Union. Bye.